Hey everyone, I'm very excited to be here. I'm an engineering manager. I've been doing interviews and talking about best practices for candidates and interviewers and hiring companies for a number of years now. And I'm very excited to share some of what I've learned with you all and to really dig into what I consider the best practices for problem solving interviews. These are mostly coding interviews, design interviews, what the high bar companies are looking for. And I have a couple hot takes. I think there's also some bad advice out there. So let me know how things are going in the comments. There's gonna be a little bit of a Halloween theme here. Let me figure out how to bring up my slides. Let me just do that. Here we go. Present. Uh-oh, is this presenting? This is not what happened in my test. Do you guys see my slides in present mode? I'm gonna need someone to audibly. Yeah. Yes? Okay, thanks. Sorry, now I can't see the chat, but I'm sure I'll get interrupted if anyone has questions in the middle of this. Okay, so let's move forward. I have a YouTube channel called Candidate Planet. You can go there to check out more, see some of my videos on tips for candidates, non-technical and technical interviews, also negotiation. For this workshop, I want to cover a few points. I want to answer questions. I have some group activities we can go through if there's time and interest. I know it's a bit difficult in these remote times, but we're going to make it work. The 4 things I want to go through, I want to break down problem-solving interview, and I want to go through these 4 steps: understanding the problem, solving the problem, communicating about it, and implementing it. And the first 3 are so important, and it's a trick because when we get into an interview, we want to like get straight to the solution. And the thing is that you're going to be assessed a ton on these first 3 things. And in fact, I don't hear people really giving tips for the second thing, how to really solve a technical problem. And so that's where I hope to provide some helpful thoughts. On the Halloween theme, I want to share what is the trick, the underlining 1-sentence trick for each of these topics before I share some examples. The trick for understanding questions is that interviewers are in fact sometimes trying to trick you. Sometimes it's unintentional, like a question is just ambiguous or unclear. But sometimes I talk to hiring managers a bunch for my work. And they want to know how candidates handle ambiguity, how candidates clarify problems, if candidates are making assumptions or not. So they're intentionally going to be asking you questions that are going to be confusing. And plus, questions are just confusing. The interviewer has seen them dozens of times. They know the solution, the stakes are low. And a very vulnerable time in an interview is those first 5 to 10 minutes where you're trying to figure out what is going on here? What am I supposed to be doing? Am I going to be managing my time correctly? Is this the right, am I giving the right answer to the wrong question, which is just going to make me look bad? So understanding the question, it's really important. I've even had hiring managers tell me if a candidate doesn't spend 15 minutes talking about this problem before they give a solution, they've already failed. So let's go through what that could mean. The first thing is get an example, for a coding interview where you have to take some input, get some output. Ask them to share an example. Even if you think you know what the problem is, go through an example so that this helps you and the interviewer make sure that you're on the same page. The interviewer might say, I want you to take an input, an array of numbers, remove the duplicates. And you might think, okay, I'm going to return back this unique list of numbers. And you do all this work. And then later the interviewer is like, no, I wanted you to return, tell me what the duplicates are, or something, right? Going through an input to output gets you on the same page with the interviewer. So you're solving the right problem, not making assumptions. And it's also helpful because you can't solve a problem that you don't know, even with your human mind, how to get to the answer. So go for those examples because sometimes interviewers, they don't give them. Edge cases. Now I want to differentiate between edge cases and invalid input because sometimes I'll ask candidates, what are the edge cases, for this problem? And they'll, say for this iterating through an array of numbers problem. And candidates will say, well, what if you get, instead of numbers, what if you get a string? What if you get none? What if you essentially get what may be considered invalid input, as opposed to edge cases. And so you don't have to list 50 invalid pieces of input. Just ask the interviewer, will I be getting invalid input or not? And that means, because some interviewers, you don't know, some interviewers, they want, if you don't handle invalid input, they think, oh, wow, like you just made all these assumptions. That's, you don't program defensively. That's not going to fit here. And other interviewers will think, why are you wasting all this time on that? I need you to solve this question, move on to another question. So you can ask about invalid input. Edge cases are, I would say, a slightly different thing. Edge cases to me are valid input that that has, where you want to, they're kind of like, they're edge cases of valid input, interesting cases like, hey, this array of numbers that has duplicates. What if the duplicates are listed multiple times, not just twice, but there's like 5 5s in the list? Or what if there's only one number? Or what if all the numbers are out of order? Should the output retain ordering? Or, there's kind of different, you can use the edge cases to explore the boundaries of this problem and not make assumptions. And so those are really good. And then you can use those as test cases in a coding problem. Edge cases can also exist for design problems, product management, things like that. If there are questions, if there's a facilitator for this workshop, please feel free to jump in. Let me know if there's any questions. I'm going to move on to the solve step otherwise. Okay, solve. The trick here is that personally, I don't think people really talk about solve. Oftentimes I think candidates are told, oh, talk to the interviewer, which is basically the understand step and the communicate step, like explain your approach, right? Pseudocode. And I just want to let y'all know, here's my hot take. When candidates haven't solved the problem, anything they say is not very interesting or helpful. It's not a good look. Like if you don't know what you're doing, what you say isn't going to be helpful. And I say this as someone who I like to figure things out verbally. I like to process my thoughts through a conversation, and that can be a technique for solving a problem. But don't skip this step. You get to decide what works for you. Like the main goal of a problem-solving interview is that you solve the problem. And maybe that's thinking to yourself for 3 minutes. Just tell the interviewer, okay, I'm going to think about this for a little bit and then I'm going to get back to you. Like whatever you're going to do to solve the problem, just tell the interviewer so they're not waiting silently and losing trust in you. That's the thing. Interviewers, they want to believe that you know what you're doing and that you're going to get there. That's a good look. So just tell the interviewer what you're going to do and then go do it. Here's some things that you can do. Sketching out the problem. If you got a tree or a graph, or you've maybe got those edge cases and you want to run through, wait, how do I unroll this, string, or how do I do this thing? Like, let's go through an example. Having some paper and pen during a remote interview and sketching, or maybe a marker during a remote interview so you can hold it up and it can be more visible in the camera. I find sketching can be quite helpful. And not all remote interview programs are going to have like a whiteboard capability. So kind of come prepared. I've even seen people have whiteboards next to them. Whatever works for you. I'm also a visual person. I think sketching can really help trying to like take notes and solve problems in a text editor. Personally, I find that very limiting, and it makes me get stuck in a rut. And that's a good look for interviewers, is maybe when someone is going down a certain path and then they're able to jump out of that rut. That's an opportunity to expose that skill. Pattern matching, this is where you do a bunch of practice so that when you see a problem, you're like, oh, that looks like blob detection. And I know how to do blob detection. I'll do a DFS and have a visited and sort of find the constraints of this, or whatever the situation. Oh, that looks like pathfinding, or, oh, I think this is whatever. Pattern matching is it kind of just relies on doing a lot of preparation and practice beforehand. Working backwards is one of my favorite things. When candidates get stuck, I think working backwards can be a really big help. And that's where you take the problem and you say, well, what was I trying to return? Or what am I trying to build at the end of this? And you start there and figure out, well, what would make it really easy for me to get to this thing? Like, I have to do some calculation and some math. Well, if I had the perfect data input, what would that look like for me to do this calculation? And then you can kind of keep working back from there, as opposed to working forward. Sometimes when we work forward, we get kind of stuck. We don't know which direction to go. So working backwards can streamline that. And that also ties into one of my favorite things, or the things to know, is that end-to-end, like having an end-to-end solution at the high level. This relates to break it down, trust me. But I am jumping the gun a little bit. But having an end-to-end solution at a high level is much more impressive to an interviewer than having half of a perfect solution. Like when you're going halfway from the forwards point, but you're like not seeing the rest of it, it just kind of looks like, oh no, this candidate's stuck. They don't know what to do. But if you kind of have a high level breakdown, sometimes if you just say, well, I know I'm going to have to process this input and put it into this hash map. And I don't really know how to do string manipulation, but I know that's going to be my first step. And then my second step, once I have this data, oh, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to iterate through this. I'm going to sort the values, and that's going to give you my solution. That looks great to me. I'm like, cool. I like your plan. You don't know all the details, but like computer science, it's all about abstraction, and we can implement those things later. We're going to talk about magic methods in the implement step as well. Breaking it down can be really helpful because it also lets you demonstrate. Maybe you can't solve this whole big problem, but if you make it simpler, or if you focus on a specific step, especially like some interesting piece of logic, hey, that looks good. And you're still demonstrating problem solving. So breaking problems down can be really helpful. That's my solve trick and tips. Again, if there's any questions, please interrupt me. Let's move on to communicate. Oh, go ahead.
There's one question. And if you want to see them, they're down in the bottom, but I'm happy to read them.
I can't, for some reason, I'm so sorry. When I tested this didn't happen, but when I went to present mode, it took up my whole screen.
Oh, okay. All right then.
And I'm just forging forward.
There's lots of great comments in the chat, so you can go back and look later.
Okay.
I asked everybody to put questions down in the ask a question function. So the first question is from Timothy. If you can't solve a problem, is there a recommended way to fail gracefully?
Yes. Yes. So one of the most graceful things you can do is, it depends on what you mean by can't solve. Like, I think one of the best things is if you can break the problem down and identify at a high level, here's the 2 steps or the 3 steps. I don't know how to do some of these, but like, here's how breaking a problem down is a skill that will look favorably. And then you can maybe solve one of the steps. Another thing is to make it simpler. Like maybe there's all these constraints and you say, well, ooh, that's very confusing. But if the input came sorted, here's what I would do, or here's how I would solve this problem. Oh, this is on 2-dimensional arrays and I'm having a little bit of trouble navigating like nested arrays, but here's what I would do if it were a single array. You can kind of have those proactive conversations with the interviewer. What doesn't look good is when someone's stuck. Like, to some extent, I like to see when people are figuring things out and seeing a challenge and sharing their thoughts and then figuring out something else. So in some interviews, like you can't do anything about it. They wanted to see that you could handle 2-dimensional arrays, and if you couldn't, you fail. But other interviews, they don't care. Like, it's just a proxy. What data structure or algorithm happens to be the thing. And if you're not familiar with it, they don't care. They're like, oh, cool, this was a nice conversation. So that's one way to fail gracefully. I love the idea. I think interviewers don't often do this, but I love the idea of interviewers starting with a little bit of a conversation and seeing how, what you're familiar with and sort of changing on the fly if things aren't working. One other tip it's also, look, interviews, sorry, I'm going to try to give a short answer to this, but I have one more thought on failing interviews, because the thing is, we all do it. Interviewing is a numbers game. And so we're all going to have times where it doesn't work out. And so part of what you're trying to do, you're trying to look at, like, being a candidate is like an iterative process where there's no one championship. And so, if you can over time keep practicing, that'll, that can help you be prepared and familiar with things. And practicing for interviews is different than like just programming, right? Like, you need to practice with someone looking over your shoulder, where you have to like explain your approach before you write code. Like, you have to go through these 3 steps before you're even able to play with code. And when you practice, even if you're just practicing by yourself, when you solve a problem, try to solve it in multiple ways so that if during the interview you get stuck, you're like, I don't see how to do this with nested arrays, but you're like, oh, but I could use a hash map. I've like done that before. Oh, I've done stuff where I've sorted and then done this other thing. So you kind of have different tools in your tool belt. So practice solving problems in different ways. Hope that helps. Oh, and the one thing I will say here, another thing is, sometimes, hey, we can't just solve problems with our minds like we're a magician, like magicians or something. We're only engineers. Sometimes you have to like play with code. You're like, sometimes we have to think with our hands. There's amazing engineers out there who've told us, like Google engineers who've said, like, this is how I actually think. So interviews, this is what I do in interviews. Just tell the interviewer, I want to play. I'm going to spend 5 minutes just writing some code to play around and to like help me think and solve this. But then once I have an idea, I'll talk, I'll explain my approach, and then I'll like do it for real. Because just so that, again, keep the interviewer in the know. That's what looks really good. Interviewers, it doesn't look good when interviewers just think you're floundering and you're stuck, or you're doing something, you're communicating or writing code and you don't actually know what you're doing, because that'll tend to waste time. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Yeah.
There's 4 more questions.
Okay.
Do you want to do them now, or do you want to do them at the end?
Actually, if I do that, I could read them real quick. But here we go. Questions. Yes, let me give the ones that are relevant to what we've covered so far, and if they're about a future topic, I'll save it till we get there. What should be the time limit to solve medium level problem in an interview? It depends on the company, because okay, here's my advice, is that all you can do is ask the interviewer what they're looking for. Like, are they looking for you to get to fully working solutions, and are there multiple problems? Are they looking to are they trying to give you one challenging problem that you have a nice conversation about and you analyze, and they pose different challenges? Are they looking for like, how important is the most optimal solution? Like, not all interviews care about optimality, and if you waste like 15 minutes trying to optimize something, that's not great. So in terms of the time limit, all you can know is just the main thing for time limits is like managing your time. And so you want to be spending time on the signal that's important to the interviewer, and you don't know what that signal is unless you ask and they kind of tell you. So you're not trying to be difficult, but yeah, in terms of time limits, like, very seldom do interviewers say, you need to get through 2.5 questions to move on to the onsite or to get an offer. But maybe you can always ask the recruiter ahead of time. There's really no hard answer here, because medium means different things to different places. Interviews are different, like different companies are looking for different things. I wouldn't worry, just keep practicing. And ideally, if you work slow and steady, that's good. And look back, whenever you do an interview, where are you spending the most time that was unproductive? And that's what you can work on. Did it take you like 20 minutes to like figure out what this error message meant? Okay, work on debugging. Fake it till do you recommend being completely honest with what you can't do or dodge? Yeah, I think being honest is useful. Don't put yourself down. I think self-deprecation doesn't look good to the interviewer, and I don't think it's like helpful for yourself. You want to be like pumping yourself up. But yeah, if you're like, oh, I don't know what this thing is, then ask them to explain what that data structure is or something. And definitely for interviews where they're asking, like, bullshit detectors are a thing. Sorry if I don't know if swearing's okay. But yeah, you can always ask, hey, I'm not very comfortable with this. Is there another question? But there often isn't. So you're going to want to just do your best. An example of working backwards through a problem. I gave sort of a calculate type example. Sometimes some questions, like more like business logic, like data manipulation questions, they'll want output in a certain format. So you want to start by thinking like, what is the return data structure? Like printing, it's always better return data than print. So like, what's my return data structure? And you can kind of work backwards from there to see a lot of interview problems are, here's some input, put stuff in an intermediate data structure, and then collate it into like what you return or the final result. And so sometimes working backwards is a nice way to figure out like what that middle thing should be. That wasn't an example, but there we go. Can you ask for a hint? Yes. I mean, if you're truly stuck, you can ask for a hint. It may or may not adversely impact you. It kind of depends. Like, it just depends on what they're looking for. But certainly, I think it's definitely better to ask for help when you're stuck. I think being stuck it isn't great. Slowly making progress, I think, is, yeah, kind of depends. All right, I'm gonna move on. We're gonna move on to communication, which let me know in the chat. How do you think my communication is going so far? Hopefully the slides are presenting again. like in a big screen. Communication, they are great. Communication, look, interviews are a conversation. So communication is one of the most important ways that we connect with interviewers and form that relationship. So I have strong feelings about this. As an interviewer, here's what I want you all to know. And here's where I think I have some hot takes, where I think that there's some advice out there that isn't helping candidates be strategic. So when you want to communicate your solution or communicate the 80% that you have or the ideas that you have, and you're trying to get feedback, because here's the thing about communication, it serves two purposes. One, it's like this incredible, it's an incredible signal. Like this is something that matters a lot to interviewers, that they are assessing how well you communicate. One of the biggest things I hear from hiring managers and in debrief meetings is either this candidate talked too much and rambled, usually in like a behavioral interview. They felt like your thoughts weren't organized. That's a whole other topic on itself. And I think that's sort of an unfair assessment. Like when I get nervous, I ramble, but it is what it is. Organized thought, using enumeration, for example, having a conversation, these things can really help. Or the other thing I hear, and I think this is mostly in the technical interviews, design, programming, that kind of thing, skill assessments. Other thing is this candidate did not talk enough. I felt like I was pulling teeth. I didn't know why they were doing things. So communication is a very important signal to express. And then also it's going to help you manage your time, to help you validate your approach so that you don't end up wasting time on when you're writing code. So here's the thing about communication is that it's risk management. And if you are very confident in your solution, you might be able to get away with just doing the first step. Oh, here we go. The high level, like a verbal highlight or a sketch, or, here's how I would solve finding the duplicates in a list of numbers. I would iterate through this array, pop everything into a hash map where the value, the number that might be duplicated is the key. The value is the count. How often have I seen that number? And then at the very end, I'm going to return the keys. Or I'm going to iterate through this array, and I'm going to have a return array. And every time I go and look at a new number, I'm going to see if it already exists in my return array. If it's already there, I'm not going to add it because I want to remove the duplicates. Whatever, right? Like you're giving your high-level approach. It's a few sentences. The interviewer might say, great, that makes sense to me. Go ahead and implement it. In which case, you can move on to implementation. They might ask questions because they might see a bug or an assumption that you've made, an edge case that you're missing. They might want you to like explore that because they're trying to help you out so you don't waste time in the implementation. They might also just be confused because as an interviewer, it's one of the most confusing things is trying to understand what someone else is telling me. I usually am just trying to understand what is the state and how is it changing. Being really specific and writing those things down can help. But if I don't understand what you've said, I might just ask you to like keep trying to explain it. We're going to keep talking about it for a little bit. So, and it depends on how confident a candidate seems, it might make that go faster or slower. But ultimately, this is risk management for you. If you feel very confident in your approach, you don't really want to spend a lot of time here. You're going to prove the result. The interesting result is going to be the implementation. There is sometimes interviewers do want to have like the complexity analysis, runtime space complexity, or you saying, oh, there's two approaches. I could do X or Y, and I'm going to do X for this reason. Or I would do Y in production, but for the sake of time, I'm going to do X. Those kinds of things do also look nice. But here's the thing, and here's the thing where communicate, I think, is often seen as the solve step, where when you're stuck, you start communicating, right? And so here's the hierarchy that I think can be helpful to go through as a way to manage risk and to help make sure you're getting towards a correct solution, is to do a walkthrough, to walk through a small example with your approach, write down the state, write down how it changes so that you can show to yourself and the interviewer, yep, my approach works. It handles this situation. The interviewer, sometimes if they think you've missed an edge case, they might say, can you walk through your solution on this particular input? And then you get a chance to see that. But this is still kind of a dance. Like interviewers are trying to be helpful, but they don't know. Maybe they don't, you don't let them waste your time. That's why I think this is risk management. Sometimes it's just faster to get the code running, like a recursion problem. Man, walking through that takes forever. That's why we have compilers. Sometimes you're just going to want to move forward to the implementation. So that's something to be aware of. Interviewers will want to spend time on communicate because one of the biggest way candidates basically fail an interview is that they don't know what they're doing. They go to the implementation stage and it's a mess. Because if you don't know what you're doing, it's going to be a mess. And to some extent, I think the same with the communicate. That's why I like to put solve before that. There's advice going around to like write pseudocode. And personally, I don't think pseudocode impresses interviewers. You're not doing it for the interviewer. You're doing it for yourself as part of risk management and to help figure out the problem and maybe identify edge cases you're missing. So the way I like to look at this hierarchy is there's no right or wrong answer. You do what you need to do to make progress forward in an interview. And so going through all these steps, that's totally fine because you want to be really confident when you get to implement that you know what you're doing. Over time, as you practice, if you can avoid doing pseudocode, if you avoid doing walkthrough, or maybe for certain data structures or algorithms that you're very comfortable with, you know, that can save you time. And I think that's good. I think it's good to get there. I think candidates who are the most successful, they're comfortable with the problems they're already being asked, so they don't need to go that deep. And that I do think can save you time, but it's, if you got to do those things, you got to do those things. Let's look at questions for a second. Let's see. Cool. And there are no new ones. In terms of PM, which I don't know if that's product manager or project manager. TPM sounds like a technical project manager. For product manager, where you're like doing, there's often skill assessments for product managers. Like, here's this, here's a problem we have. How would you, what questions would you ask? What data would you get in order to figure out what product like changes or time or timeline we should create? And same for user design. For project managers, it's more often purely behavioral interviews. Maybe there's skill assessments in terms of like communication or writing. So some of this maybe doesn't apply in terms of the coding sense, but whenever there's a skill assessment, you definitely want to have these general steps in mind. Because usually the process matters just as much as the outcome. Okay, last and not least, implementation, which for design interviews would be like architectural would be coming up with like a diagram or data model, that sort of thing. For just sort of data science, often it'll be like literally manipulating data and coming to insights. I want to hone in on coding interviews. I just think these are they're a common gate for a lot of engineering adjacent and of course software engineering jobs. And the devil is in the details here. And so implementation is all about time management and risk management, especially today when a lot of things are virtual. When things were on a whiteboard, you could kind of write the big picture and you didn't have to get everything exactly right because we can't compile on a whiteboard. But in a coding interview where you're literally writing code that's going to compile and the interviewer wants to see you pass test cases, sometimes those bugs, then spending 15 minutes on some dumb bug, that can really hurt you. So couple tips. One, run incrementally. I've had candidates tell me be concerned that they would get like points taken off if they run their code and like doesn't work. And to me, it's way better if while you're writing the code, run it incrementally. This is risk management. If you're writing a for loop and you're not sure about the range, or if you're hitting all the elements, or if you're not sure about something, validate that right away. Don't write 50 lines of code, have a bug, and then you have to figure out where it is. So just test any sort of risk, maybe you don't have to test every single line of code, but anything that seems particularly risky that you're unsure of, you might as well run the code as you go. I think that can be really helpful. Use methods. This helps with those edge cases. Like whenever you have to write code, put it in a method. Like at least have one method that takes input, returns output, so you can print your edge cases. Your edge cases can be an actual test suite that you print. I think also using methods, whenever you can break things up and use methods, that helps you compartmentalize code, build confidence. It's easier to debug. I mean, you're not trying to make your code clear. For interviewers, like if we're being honest, interviewers care that you get a correct working solution. That's way more important than how clear your code is. I think that's even more important than optimality. I think having optimal solutions often makes it easier. Like, hey man, use hash maps, right? They'll make things simpler. They're a great tool. They'll also make things optimal. But you want to choose an approach that you can relatively straightforwardly and correctly execute and make working. That's often one of the most, that's gonna be one of the most impressive things. So if your code is confusing to you, that's the biggest problem. So whatever, using methods, using nice variable names, do whatever is going to make it, is going to help you succeed and not introduce bugs or that kind of thing. It's not a great look when candidates confuse themselves, because then I'm like, whoa, your code's definitely confusing. I wasn't going to judge it so bad before, but now if you're mixing up rows and columns or whatever, hey, that's like, that's on you. So trying not to get confused is pretty valuable for time management and just as a good look. Interviewers know you're not perfect, and if you're having to debug every now and then, hey, you're getting to show the interviewer that you can debug. It's not terrible. But if you're having to debug 20 bugs, or if it's taking 20 minutes, that might be a problem. Use magic methods. This goes back to that statement earlier about if you're running out of time, what do? Get the full end-to-end skeleton written. Use magic methods if you're running out of time or if you don't know how to do something. It's so much more impressive to have, if someone has the full skeleton and there's some things they haven't implemented, I'm like, oh, that's details. You've mostly got it. I know that you can, that you see the big picture. Having half of a perfectly implemented solution, that partial credit is going to be really hard to get. To have that be as meaningful. So those are some high-level problem-solving tips that I especially think high-bar companies are looking for. And there's no new questions. That's great. If there are questions, put them in. And what I would like to do with the rest of this time, if people are game for it, is we can do a little group activity where we go through problem solving. It's some questions that we problem solve together. Maybe put in the chat what you think. Yes or no, are you game to do some coding problem solving together, just as a group demo where we go through using some of this? Alternatively, you can ask questions and say, hey, this is what happened in an interview. How would you have graded this? Or I have an interview, I'm interviewing for this role. What questions do you think I'll get asked? Yes, group activity. Okay. Thanks, Antonio. And yes, there's a way to get my slides for reference. They're in a folder that Tech Conclusion has that we will share shortly. Well, I guess I have slides. These are my slides here, but these are not the ones in that folder. So that folder might also be a good place to look. Okay, let's do a group activity. Okay, often, okay, you can also come back and review this session later on Crowdcast. That's great. So often I start with my group activity with the iterating, removing duplicates from arrays, but I feel like maybe I spoiled that one already. Let's do a different problem. Let's do, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to pretend like I'm interviewing all of you. And so what would you do if your interviewer asked you, what I'd like you to do is take, I'm going to give you a domain with some number of subdomains like docs.google.com or crowdcast.io. And I'd like you to return a list of each of those subdomain components. But you can't use, I don't want you to use split, for example. I want you to write that function. Okay, that's the question. What would you do? And hopefully no one's like, cool, I'm going to start writing code. And I think Desmond, are you crying about this question? Don't cry. All questions seem confusing at first. We're gonna talk it through. Could you give us an example again? Sarah, you get the prize. Let me give some examples. When I'm nervous, I don't even hear like everything that's coming at me. Like that's like a physiological approach. A thing that happens, we stop taking input. And so get the interviewer to write stuff down, make it visual. So maybe we have docs.google.com, and that's the input. And as output, we want like a list. Docs, Google.
Hey, Lusen, can
Yes.
you your screen sharing down so everybody can see you bigger?
Yeah, that is a great idea. Let me not close video. Oh, sorry, I don't know why I'm like, wait, how do I do, how is this?
Wait, you have to do it eventually, but yeah. There we go.
Oh,
Perfect.
Someone figured it out for me. Thank you. Okay. Return. Yep, Timothy, you got that. I like your restatement. Return a list of each of the subdomain components. Deborah, ask clarifying questions. Yes. Do you have any? Antonio, I like you said look for the period in the domain. That's a critical point. That's like a great, even if you didn't know how to do that, saying that out loud is perfect. At this point, we might want some more edge cases. Let's just make sure we don't have any assumptions that are getting made. We're not allowed to use regex or split. I'm just gonna also personally, unless you're really good at regex, it mostly fails in interviews because it takes a lot of time. It's something to consider. If that's a tool that you're really comfortable with, your tool belt, great. If you get a question specifically that wants you to use regex, I'm sorry. I don't know why that's happening to you. Maybe that's a very specialized role. But I think regex is often not the thing you want to turn to. And for that matter, often for a lot of these problem-solving interviews, it's not about using a fancy function. Like someone originally said, like, oh, use filter. Things like, there's, different, in your language, there might be different tools and functions that you go to. If you are comfortable doing that, and if it works for you, great. A lot of problems, they really can just be solved with loops, if statements, being comfortable managing state, like integers, arrays, and hash maps. If you can put those pieces together to solve problems, that's often like the most straightforward, fastest way you're going to do things. Sometimes when candidates see a problem and instead of coming up with like an algorithm, they're like, oh, well, I could string together these fancy, quote unquote, fancy functions. It often doesn't go well. So I'm not saying don't do it. If you're really comfortable, that's fine. But to me, there's gotchas in that. And sometimes interviewers will ask a problem that seems straightforward, and then they're going to want to keep making it more and more challenging. And so you're more flexible if you have basic things. Okay. Would there be any other special characters? Just normal normal domain characters. This isn't meant to be a trick question. Well, I'm going to say, personally, I would love to see people typing edge cases instead of giving solutions, but I understand the interest to jump to the solution because you're like, this is a pretty easy problem, let's just solve it. But don't we kind of need to know, like, can you get just com? Right? We can get google.com. Can we get a really long domain like this? Just don't forget to list some edge cases. It looks good. That's another thing that interviewers and debriefs, they're going to talk about whether or not you make assumptions and whether or not you list edge cases. So just do it a little bit of it at least. Okay. .co.uk. Yeah, like, is there a preceding period? In this case, nope. It would be something that you could put in a browser and have it make sense. Timothy, the example edge cases are those things I listed, google.com, the really long one. We could put one with like an umlaut, for example. Antonio, question of, would you prefer to use a recursive call or use iteration instead? Whatever the candidate prefers is fine by me. Whatever works to get it done. If you're wondering, you could sometimes you could also say, look, I could do this recursively or iteratively. Do you care? Sometimes the interviewer will say, well, what are the trade-offs? They just want to understand what you're thinking, and that's kind of cool. You won't get, I love that, Mohammed. Yep, you won't get apple.com. Is that valid to have multiple dots? I don't know. I'm going to try that. But in this case, you'll never get that. That didn't work for me in a browser. Okay. And we have 5 minutes to go. So I understand we should probably wrap up. I want all of you to try to solve this problem multiple ways. Use recursion, use iteration, use a for loop. Think about how this could be more difficult. Maybe we want to unroll this domain so that we can track, like, okay, we start with docs.google.co.uk, and we want to not just split that up individually, but we want to get google.co.uk, we want to get co.uk, we want to know all the possible hierarchy. I think that makes this problem more challenging. Maybe it's almost like a different problem. And send me, if anyone wants to send me their solutions over email, I would be happy to give you feedback and support and encouragement. You can email me at lusen@candidateplanet.com. And thank you for coming to this workshop presentation Q&A. And try not to use splice just for this one in particular. Don't use splice, don't use split. Like, figure out, how am I going to iterate through a string? How am I going to write this algorithm myself? Like, what if I had to write those functions?
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Oh.
You have a couple of minutes if you want.
Oh, great. Thanks for all of the hype around my drawings. That makes me feel amazing. I was recently told, in the slides will be shared. So I shared the slides, and I think Melinda has another way to share them. I was recently told there's a big difference between production-worthy code and code made to experiment with a solution. What would you think is the main difference? Was this an interview question? Look, here's what I'm going to tell you. That's a great question. All the sort of behavioral questions, like, speak from your experience, it's going to be fine. Here's what I would give you as an advice just for interviews is, I love when a candidate says, in production, I would do this, I would do X, I would name it this, or I would have this test case, or I would make classes, but for the purposes of this interview, to save time, I'm going to do this other thing. And then I know, oh, cool, they can do that in production. They know that it's important. They might even tell me why it's important, or I might ask them. But then we can get through that in the interview. We can move on. We can make it fast. One of the best tricks, so hash maps or hash tables, whatever it is in your language, dictionaries in Python, objects in JavaScript, those are a really important and valuable tool for coding interviews, for making optimal solutions. And two, consider how you can use those to represent relationships, graphs, trees, etc., so that you're not having to build classes during a lot of problem-solving interviews. They're not meant to be like a speed test, but if you can work steadily through and have some sort of tricks in your back pocket, that can help. So it doesn't look like interview code, doesn't look like production code. Will the delimiter be only dot? Yes. Oh, and I'll give you, candidateplanet.com. Check out my videos. Thanks for your support and encouragement. I took a little hiatus, but I'm excited to generate more topics. So feel free to let me know what you'd like to see. And I currently have some of my most recent videos. I have older ones on negotiation, but some of the recent ones are specifically around array tips and tricks, problem solving, communication, rambling. Let me know what you're interested in. Thank you so much, everyone who's here, and enjoy the rest of this career fair. Tech Inclusion is such an amazing event. Thank you, Melinda, for inviting me to be part of it.